Once, while Jesus was standing beside the lake of Gennesaret, and the crowd was pressing in on him to hear the word of God, he saw two boats there at the shore of the lake. The fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little way from the shore. Then he sat down and taught the crowds from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we have worked all night long but have caught nothing. Yet if you say so, I will let down the nets." When they had done this, they caught so many fish that their nets were beginning to break. So they signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats so that they began to sink. But when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." For he and all who were with him were amazed at the catch of fish that they had taken. And so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid. From now on you will be catching people." When they had brought their boats to shore, they left everything and followed him. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
So you just heard Luke's version of the call of the disciples. Jesus is walking along the shore and a huge crowd is following him, wanting to hear what he has to say. He walks by the shore and sees some fishermen who have just come in from their night's work, who are putting away the motors, cleaning the nets, stacking up life jackets, etc. And for these fishermen, you wonder if Jesus and the crowd that are following him are just a nuisance, really. "Excuse me, people, I know you want to see Jesus, but please don't stand on my nets." But Jesus gets in Simon Peter's boat and says, "Put out from shore a little way." And Peter obeys. Jesus then teaches to the crowd that's gathered on the shore. And when he's done teaching, he turns to Simon and says, "Take the boat to deeper water. Let's go catch some fish." And Peter, no matter what he thought about this order from a guy who was not a fisherman but was a preacher, Peter says, "Sir, we fished all night and we caught nothing. But if you want, we can go out." Now in Matthew and Mark's gospel, when they talk about calling the disciples, the call appears to be the first time Jesus has actually seen the disciples. In those accounts, it's even more remarkable that Simon goes along with the pleas of this stranger who has just climbed into his boat. But in Luke's story, though, listen to this story from the previous chapter, beginning at verse 38, which is right after the story Victor preached last week, the one where Jesus got run out of town for preaching mercy. Well, yeah. Here it is. After leaving the synagogue, Jesus entered Simon's house. Simon's mother-in-law was suffering from a high fever, and they asked Jesus about her, and Jesus stood over her and rebuked the fever, and it left her. So we don't know if Simon knew Jesus before this healing story at his house in Capernaum. I've been to Capernaum. If you've been to the Holy Land, maybe you've been there as well. There is now a church that is built over the ruins of Peter's house, but the rest of it looks very undeveloped, and so you can imagine Jesus walking there. The ruins of the synagogue are very near to Simon's house, and it's all very close to the shore of the Galilee at Gennesaret. It is one of my favorite places in the Holy Land, and I felt close to Jesus when I was there. The picture on the bulletin cover is one my friend Kelly took on a recent trip to the Holy Land. In Luke's account, when Jesus gets in Simon's boat, Simon already knows exactly who Jesus is. Jesus is the guy who can rebuke a fever to heal a loved one. We're going to assume that his mother-in-law was a loved one, right? The Bible isn't clear about their relation, but we trust that it was a good one. Everything I thought I knew about the call of the disciples is up for grabs in the way Luke orders the story. Because Simon has seen what Jesus can do in his very own home, and yet Simon is not in the crowd pressing in to hear what Jesus has to teach. Simon is washing his nets after a night of work. Simon's first encounter with Jesus has not translated to him following Jesus. Simon is still a fisherman. Simon is not a disciple. So Jesus comes to him again. Jesus is like that. Sometimes we or our loved ones need healing. Sometimes we need help fishing. But Jesus keeps meeting us where we are and inviting us to take the next step because maybe Jesus has things for us to do too. Master, we have worked all night but have caught nothing, yet if you say so, I will let down the nets. Simon Peter's decision to cast the nets is at least a glimmer of faith, a willingness to trust that maybe this Jesus guy is worth listening to. And as soon as the nets are in the water, the fish arrive, and so many that their nets start to break. So they call to the other boats to come out and help them. And all the boats are so full of fish that they're worried they're going to sink. Peter drops to his knees and tells Jesus that Peter's a sinful man and that Jesus ought to leave him. Because Peter has recognized something in Jesus, from how he healed his mother-in-law to what Jesus said when he was teaching, to the authority with which he commanded them, to the way he outfished the professional fishermen. Peter recognized that Jesus was not like us. And Peter recognized his own broken, frail, human self. He realized if this rabbi is looking for people to become like him, for someone to teach all he knows, then Jesus better look somewhere else because we're not worthy. Have you ever had that experience where you were picked for a team, and you picked for a team that you don't really think you're qualified for? You ever wonder, why did they pick me when they haven't called on so-and-so? When you have those moments, that imposter syndrome, when people pick you instead of the person you would have chosen, do you ever think, if they chose me, I guess they're not quite as smart as I thought they were? It happens to all of us. And I understand Peter dropping to his knees and telling Jesus that you have picked the wrong boat, buddy. It is very nice you stopped by. I really appreciate all these fish, but I know these guys, and trust me, we are not the disciples you were looking for. Jesus tells them to leave behind their boats, their nets, that giant haul of fish they just caught, and to leave behind their fears of their inadequacy, their fears that they have nothing to offer to God because they are just fishermen, to leave behind their fears that Jesus has made a bad decision that he will regret in a few days. If Jesus wants disciples like Peter and Simon and the rest of them, then there is room for us. If Jesus didn't go to career day at the temple to pick out his disciples, we should take note. If he called disciples who are just minding their own business, fixing their nets, going to soccer practice, binge watching something on Netflix, whatever, then perhaps we can expect him to call us as well. Perhaps all of the excuses we have not to answer Jesus' call, we're not educated enough, we're not old enough, we're too old, we're not smart enough, we're too smart, we're too busy, whatever, perhaps those excuses aren't going to work for us anymore. After Peter points out that Jesus is hanging out with the wrong people, namely himself, Jesus says, "Have no fear, Peter. From now on, you will be fishing for people." And I've been thinking about this metaphor. It's a little troubling. As I said with the kids, we don't throw hooks into people so we can snag them out of their lives into an environment where they can't breathe. But all my life, I've heard this story preached as an evangelism text. If you become a disciple and follow Jesus, if you fish for people, then your church will be overflowing. You will have so many fish people, you won't know what to do. And I had a different sermon partially written around that text, around that idea. But then the actions of this week sent me back to the drawing board. And I promise you, I try not to be partisan in my preaching, but this week our government was dismantled by a felon while his party cheered him on. He pardoned dangerous convicted criminals who sought to overthrow the government 4 years ago when he lost the election, all while claiming that draconian immigration orders he just also passed are to save us from criminals crossing the border. He wrote executive orders that cannot, in fact, change the law, but can create chaos and confusion, One of them tries to end birthright citizenship, something enshrined in the Constitution he vowed to protect. He's threatening the deportation of millions of people and promising to invade churches and hospitals and schools to find them. He's seeking to remove rights from LGBTQIA citizens and is endangering the health and the safety of trans kids. His supporters even made death threats to an Episcopal priest who preached a sermon where she kindly asked the president to show mercy to vulnerable people. One sitting member of Congress said that priest should be deported, even though she was born in New Jersey. This week, Jesus' call to fish for people doesn't feel like an instruction to go get more church members the way I'd always heard it. This week, it feels like a call to take our boats out into a storm to rescue people who are at risk of drowning, throwing a lifeline to people who are clinging to the wreckage created by this administration. To be a disciple, to be a follower of Jesus in these days is going to involve some motion sickness, some choppy water, and waves that threaten to overtake our lifeboats. And if you don't feel qualified for that, don't worry, you're not alone. But Jesus doesn't call the equipped, he equips the called. Jesus calls disciples even when they don't have qualifications for their job, and he calls us to fish for people. And I don't like this any more than you do. My preferred day by water and boats includes sunscreen and a good book. I don't want to have to put on a life jacket and brave stormy seas. In truth, I feel more qualified to sit on the shore and read a book than I do to go out into a storm. But there is a storm raging in our country right now, and Jesus calls us to respond, so we will. I've been thinking about Peter a lot this week, how he'd seen Jesus heal his mother-in-law and then just gone back to his life as a fisherman before encountering Jesus again by his boat. I bet he didn't want to take that boat back out either. I bet there was a part of him that had zero desire to fish for people because he was tired, because he already hadn't caught any fish the night before, and he wondered how effective he possibly could be at catching people if he couldn't catch fish. But Scripture tells us he obeyed Jesus' instruction to fish for people, and it changed his life, because Simon Peter becomes Peter, the rock on whom Jesus will build the church. What happened this week in politics was intentional. It was a campaign of shock and awe intended to overwhelm us and to distract us. They continue to talk about invading Greenland so we won't notice he's ending funding for cancer research and disaster assistance and public health, and the list goes on. If you are overwhelmed and worried, that's a good thing, even if it doesn't feel very good right now. It means you don't think cruelty is okay. It means you care for the safety of people other than yourself. It means you don't want to normalize Nazi salutes and racism in government policies. So take heart. Jesus is calling us to respond and to get back onto our boats, armed with life jackets and Dramamine, and head out into that storm so we can fish for people who need the church to show up and help them keep from drowning. The one thing that has brought me comfort this week is you, this congregation, because we don't have to do this alone, isolated from each other. We do this together. When Peter's boat started sinking because he had too many fish in his nets, he signaled his friends to bring their boats and come and help. And they did. I'm grateful for this community and for this congregation. This is not the first time Calvary has had to stand together to save people from drowning in the storms of life. Woven throughout our 170-year history are countless stories of Calvary people braving the waves to fish for people who are hanging on to debris from the shipwrecks of the world. And Jesus calls us to do it again, not for a political agenda, but for love and for mercy and for hope. Anne Lamott, in one of her recent books, says this: "Love is our only hope, and it is not always the easiest choice, but it is always the right one, and the noble path, and the way home to safety, no matter how bleak the future looks." Friends, love is the path through this storm we are in. So let's put on our life jackets and fish for people together.